dead ratio. In Racine County, the sheriff there actually filed legitimate election fraud charges on several people there for their participation in harvesting scams in Racine County. My estimate for Wisconsin was 260,000 fraudulent votes for Joe Biden and a Donald Trump victory of almost 8 points. The rolls are critical, and while I'm on the topic, I just don't want to forget to talk about this. This is a great organization, not only in Florida, but all throughout the country. So, Lou, good job. Keep up the great work. Everybody give them a hand. But the organization needs your support. And the reason I'm bringing it up now is because I read an article recently by Jay Valentine in which he pointed out Wisconsin in 2020. From August to November, 3 months leading up to the election, the Democrats and their activists bought the entire voter roll of the state of Wisconsin 16 times. 16 times. That would be an average. That would be once every 5.5 days. And the cost was $12,000. The Democrats fund their operations magnificently. They know what they have to spend money on to drive people out, what they have to do to corrupt the vote. And likewise, the organizations here absolutely require your support. So please, while you're listening, figure out how you can support with your time and your money to the organization, because it's critical, because we did not do this in Wisconsin in 2020 and we paid the price. So cleaning out the voter rolls is also going to require us to have the transparency to understand that they're not actually going back in and loading electronically more fraudulent ghost voters. Number 2, ban all electronic elections equipment. Ballot marking devices, scanners, tabulators, electronic poll books. These are all critical, and I don't care about the vendor. We've got several big vendors out there with election equipment, electronic elections equipment. This is critical because these feed off of fraudulent voter rolls, and they have capabilities that we can't even track because they're so fast. They can tap into electronic voter rolls and automatically turn out voters who aren't going to show up. They have the data, they have the statistics to understand that you or I may show up and vote. We're what's called 4-4 voters. We voted in all 4 of the last 4 federal elections. And then they know who hasn't voted since 1992. They know, just like Chris has pointed out, how they can get an absentee ballot to someone who doesn't have the ability to receive other mail. They have the ability to end around every single thing. And of course, in Maricopa County, we have a smoking gun there, in which the 2021 Senate audit revealed that Maricopa County was subpoenaed for logged routers and other elections equipment and refused to comply, whereas you or I would be in prison for not complying with a subpoena. And we had the malfunctioning, supposedly accidental, on election day, in which the turnout was 3.5 to 1 in favor of Republicans. That should serve as a warning that there will not be the ability to outrun fraudulent elections. And I said that in August because Kerry Lake's vote showed up on election day, and I knew that they'd have 3 months to get around it and make sure that that election day turnout didn't materialize. Number 3, voter ID with paper ballots only. Should be very simple. There's one thing about having voter ID law, and then there's another about making sure it's enforced across every precinct in every county. In Texas, we have okay voter ID laws. And in my 85% Republican county, they're gonna look that ID over left, right, up, and down, 6 ways from Sunday. But if I go to Houston and look around, or Austin or Dallas, sounds good to me, we don't need to see an ID. It's critical, but the paper ballots is the replacement for the machines. And there's a lot of things we have to do to get there, including precinct sizes, which I will address. But paper ballots and voter ID counted at the precinct, tabulated there, reported forward from the precinct, absolutely must occur. And we have to make it possible for people to make the decision, especially in our smaller counties, to get away from machines. This is before we even talk about the issue that Democrats like to make about voter ID, that it's suppressing the vote somehow. I don't know a single person that has failed to obtain an identification card based on the color of their skin. And I think you need to make that argument with your political opponents, that there's really nothing more racist than insinuating an entire group of people based on the color of their skin can't obtain ID. Point number 4, ban mail-in voting. I have an asterisk here, and that would be to amend this to say severely restrict mail-in voting. I think the exceptions are obvious. Absentee ballots allowable for overseas military and the legitimately disabled with a notary. Other than that, how do we survive all these years in our elections without mail-in voting? Mail-in voting is a way to keep transparency away from the voters and to make sure that ballot harvesters can go into here defrauding elections. It's not just the presidential elections. Trump ran off with South Florida, or at least closed the margins there so tightly that couldn't be overcome. But a lot of these school board races or city council races are decided by tens of votes. Tens of votes. Now, we don't know where the mail-in ballots all go. But Jimmy Carter, yes, the same Jimmy Carter that is the only person happy Joe Biden is in the White House today, said as part of a bipartisan panel 15 years ago with James Baker that mail-in voting is one of the quickest ways to defraud an election. Combine that with corrupt voter rolls and ballot harvesters, and you have a recipe for disaster. Point number 5, ban early voting.
Yes.
The asterisk, severely restricted. So your doctors, nurses, pilots, election workers, people that legitimately can't turn up on a single day. We can have a very limited window for early vote. Very limited. Early vote used to not be a thing. You can thank Texas for the early vote. In 1917, Texas began to put early voting laws on the books, and within 70 years, it was just come on in and vote early for fun. And in 2020, in response to the so-called COVID pandemic, Governor Abbott decided to authorize a third week of early voting, just in case 2 full weeks weren't enough. A third week. And what did Democrats do? They responded by organizing drive-through voting units. In other words, it's dangerous for me to get out of my car and vote, so here's 5 IDs, 6 IDs, 7 IDs, pass me the ballots. Of course, that is Houston. They did this in San Antonio, they did it in Dallas, they did it in the Rio Grande Valley, and Trump had a gain in Texas, very much like the one I showed you in Florida. Yet the result was the tightest Republican margin of victory since 1996. Joe Biden had 600,000 more votes in Texas than Trump won the state with in 2016. Number 6. Oh, and by the way, on election day, I was under the impression that the Constitution spells out one day for us to vote in our federal elections. And we've come to call that day election day. Not election weeks, not election months, but in several states they begin mail-in voting in September of a presidential year. Point 6, drastically smaller precincts. Sounds boring, but it's critical. In Maricopa County in 2020, Arizona, several precincts had more than 7,000 votes cast. With turnout rates reported in the 70s, that means that a number of these precincts had more than 10,000 registered voters per precinct. With a precinct roll that large, there's no way to screen the roll for accuracy, to update it, to understand who's moved out of the precinct, who's moved in, who's changed names, identify any sorts of issues. There's no way to tabulate votes easily. There's no way to QA/QC the election on the back end. And that's by design, because precincts that are so large that require massive lines to vote, we need to find a workaround. So there's mail-in voting, and there's, of course, early voting. But if we were to get precincts down to the recommended 1,200 registered voters per precinct, that came out of the Maricopa Independent Canvas by Liz Harris, then we would have a pathway to push for what Donald Trump is pushing for. One day, one vote, paper ballots, count them at the precinct. But until these come down, we're stuck with the so-called relief that they've prescribed to get around the long voting lines. Smaller precincts, and what it really means is we're going to need 5 or 6 times more election workers than we already don't have. So it may not be glamorous, but we need people to volunteer and work these elections. That's a critical thing, because the fraud happens down at the lowest level in many cases, but not all. Number 7, ban ballot harvesting. When I think about the 10 points, when I think about these 10 points, Florida always comes to mind as a state that has checked the box on one of them. So the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, signed a bill making ballot harvesting a felony. That is a big deal. Ballot harvesting is the secret sauce behind amping up mail-in voting turnout, especially for candidates who don't campaign, or they campaign from a basement yet somehow still manage to set records everywhere. I would also loop into this one of my four for the core, which is banning unsupervised drop boxes. In Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled that unsupervised drop boxes not only are illegal, but were illegal at the time of the 2020 election, which of course should have meant the legislature should have decertified the election. They did not. Ballot harvesting goes hand in hand with corrupt voter rolls and mail-in voting for Democrat success. Number 8, Election Day is a holiday. When we see this being pushed in public, it's going to be a good sign that people have had their fill of lack of transparency in our elections. Every political ideology, pretty much every rank and file Democrat or Republican will support this. The only people that won't be behind it are professional bureaucrats who know that the only way we'll want this is if we can restrict mail-in votes and early votes and all the other shortcuts that they've given themselves to work around our elections. Election Day is a holiday. We protect pretty much everything else with a holiday, but not our sacred election day, which is in our Constitution. It is time that we move to a solution like this. Come out and vote. We'll keep them open midnight to midnight. On paper, we'll count them up, and we'll have our results. Number 9, new reporting requirements for transparency. This sounds boring like point 6, but it is essential because transparency is what we're actually pushing for. And named after this weasel from up north, Brad Raffensperger. I call them the Raffensperger rules because DeKalb County counted votes until Biden won Georgia, and then they counted no more votes in the state. No more Alaska rules where we're requesting a mail-in ballot the day before an election. No more North Carolina rules where we count the votes for 9 days after the election. And I would say, as part of an organized effort, the largest counties in the state are required to report their votes first. It doesn't make any sense to me. Has anybody ever played poker and thrown out of 3 of a kind and then your buddy got up to use the bathroom and 5 minutes later came back with straight flush? Is anybody gonna let him take the money off the table after that happened? So what happens is our counties with 40 or 50,000 votes throw their votes on the table, go home for the night. And then we let Fort Lauderdale count their votes as long as needed in a close race. Or more appropriate for the current political environment, Philadelphia or Milwaukee or Detroit or Atlanta or Phoenix. This is never ending because in about 10 years at this rate, we're going to say the same thing about Dallas and Austin. Things are looking good for Barron Trump in Texas, but Dallas and Houston haven't reported yet. Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington. In fact, I've done the math. The Democrats control the electoral votes of 18 states with a single county that has a larger Democrat margin than any possible combination of Republican margins can put together. Cook County, Illinois has a larger Democrat margin than any counties put together could make up in Illinois for Republicans. That will be solved by complete transparency. And number 10, heavy prison sentences for all who commit fraud. I really don't know what the deal is with PowerPoint, but it likes to correct firing squads to prison sentences. Now, what can we do about it specifically? Those are points that those of you who are well-connected and organized can begin pushing. And in fact, in some states, they've pushed a lot of these to the top. In Nebraska, several of those are going forward. In Oklahoma and Arkansas, several of those are going forward. However, those are not competitive political landscapes. The more competitive things get, it's a lot more dicey. People don't want to give up their precious machines. People don't want to limit mail-in ballots. In fact, in a lot of states, they're rubbing Tabasco in our eyes and trying to make things worse, pushing ranked choice voting. In Washington, they're trying to push a bill requiring everyone to cast a ballot. Sounds like freedom to me. So there are 4 points, especially for those of you from outside the county. We have 3,143 counties and independent cities in the United States. 3,143. We think we know everything. But I was in Bastrop, Texas in October with David Clements, and we did an election integrity event. And one of their guys came up after the event, was talking with us, and he said, "Are y'all coming to the county commissioners meeting tomorrow?" So trying to walk the walk, we went. And Dave stood up and he addressed the commissioner's court, and he mentioned voting machines. And it was clear, based on their response to us, that nobody had ever addressed the elections issue there. Why? Because we're Bastrop County. Clearly, there's not any issues going here. We're Republican. We've been Republican since Calvin Coolidge. No issues here, right? And it came to me that we really only think we know what we know. We don't know. We know about Fulton. We know about Wayne County. We know about Maricopa. But do we really know about Glades County? Do we know about Manatee? Do we know about Monroe County? Do we know about Nassau County? Because we don't. People have been restricted in their thinking that this is a Philadelphia problem. It's not. And people are wanting to get involved. So I've got the 4 points that I call 4 for the core. And they come off the 10 that I just briefed. The 4 points that can be acted upon at the county level are these 4. I call them the 4 pillars. Pillar 1 goes along with point 1 of the 10. That is voter registration. I'm not going to elaborate too much on the slide. I'm going to give you a website instead. Cleaning out the voter rolls. This is at the county level. We have to take ownership. And the more I think about it, it resembles a military structure. Because if the fire teams fail, the squad fails. And if it fails, the section fails. And if it fails, the platoon fails. And if that fails, the company fails. And if that fails, the battalion does, and the brigade does. And then the division does, and then the corps does. And then the field army fails, and then the entire army fails. Because the failure began at the lowest level. We have given way to a culture of not paying attention at the lowest level. So for everybody